Good evening. Glad everybody could join us. As you guys hopefully were in the room here just a second ago, tonight's lesson is the final in this series, and it's focused in on, obviously, the theme for the entire Vacation Bible School is Fearless Faith. This one is focused in on Paul, and then Paul's faith in action. So Paul's often thought about as probably one of the more interesting and inspirational figures in Scripture. For most Christians, it would go without saying that he played a significant role in spreading the gospel during the first century. We first come to know him, though, as Saul. He's a violent, zealous persecutor of the early church, who later was converted as described in Acts 9. But after that account, he spends the rest of his life in active service to Christ. So the very first lesson, there's always a theme, right? So every time it's with an A. So we covered accuracy and attention and availability. And then again, tonight's will be focused in on action. So Paul's missionary travels took place roughly over a 10-year stretch. It's been estimated by some that during those 10 years, Paul would have covered over 10,000 miles. He would have spent about 281 days in travel time. There's no traffic involved in that. There is some sidetracking, but 281 days in transit over the 10-year period. It would have cost over 1,700 denarii in ship travel alone. So boat fare, 1,700 denarii per person. So Paul wasn't always by himself. Now, a single denarius would have been about a day's wage at that time. So that would mean about 5 years of wages per person in this sea travel. I used a website. It's called testamentpress.com. They have an ancient money calculator. So I input the 1,700 denarius. I had to list the minimum wage of what it was here in Alabama currently, which is $7.25. At that minimum wage, that would calculate up to $73,950 in today's money over that 10-year period. So, in addition to Paul's 3 missionary journeys, he wrote letters to the churches at the time, and also to individual churches. Sometimes they were addressed to more than one group, but sometimes just to specific churches. About half of the New Testament is made up of these letters. So, how was Paul so successful in preaching and teaching the gospel? How was he able to have such fearless faith, especially in the face of violent opposition? It's described in 2 Corinthians 11. He recalls tales of beatings, shipwrecks, being stoned, being whipped, encountering robbers, being hungry, being thirsty, weather extremes. So, although we may not share Paul's personality type, his experiences, or his background, that doesn't stop us from being able to imitate him to help us develop a more fearless faith. 1 Corinthians 11:1, he gives this very instruction about imitating him as he imitates Christ. Tonight we're going to look at his system of preaching. This is the same thing that the kids are learning about, Paul's system. And this system of preaching the gospel, we're going to look at 2 different examples from the book of Acts. And this system is just the methods or the plan that he uses in order to spread the gospel in an effective manner. So the first example we're going to look at begins in Acts 17. Now, during his second missionary journey, he finds himself alone in Athens. Now, this may be the first time that we find Paul out preaching on his own since he was sent out by the church in Antioch. Now, there's some things to notice about how and why Paul spent his time. So, we're going to look at the first part of Paul's system, the idea of redeeming the time. So this is making the best use of the time, as he states in Ephesians 5:16. The original word translated would literally mean to gain something, especially an advantage or an opportunity, or make the most of. So Paul understood that time was a valuable commodity. It should be used wisely for God's purpose. So we'll take a deeper look at how he made the most of his time in Athens. At the time, Athens would have been considered one of the world's most influential cities, and definitely the cultural and philosophical center of the Greco-Roman world. Now, this was the city that was the native home of Socrates and Plato, and the adopted home of Aristotle. Now, Paul wasn't just taking up space while he was in Athens. It says that his spirit was provoked by being there. When verse 16 tells us this, the basic principle in use of this phrase is that he was being affected in the deepest part of who he was. He was experiencing the city on a deeper level than maybe a tourist would experience it. The Greek word that's translated as provoked means to urge on, stimulate, or to provoke to wrath, irritate. So Paul was inwardly bothered by the city of Athens. Verse 16 finishes, and we see why. The city of Athens had been given over to idolatry. Now, secular writers at the time commented that the Athenians greatly surpassed others in their zeal for religion. One wrote, on every side there were altars, victims, temples, and festivals. A city filled with statues and busts of men and little g gods. It was stated during the time of Nero that Athens was home to around 30,000 public idols. Now, that doesn't include the idols that may have been in individuals' homes, not in their residences. So during the time that Paul was there, the population is estimated to be around 10,000 people. So public idols outnumber people 3-1. So all these carvings and statues, they didn't impress Paul. They infuriated Paul. He knew that he had to make the best use of his time while there, and he had to take action. But the question was, what action to take? Preach in the streets with a megaphone? Make signs and protest against the idol's presences? Organize social or maybe a religious movement to overthrow those in power in the city? Paul chooses none of these paths. And knowing Paul's past as Saul, as we do, that first idea of preaching in the streets would seem like a reasonable response for him. That might have been his gut, his initial, this is what I'm going to do. But this brings us to the second part of his system, and that's reasoning. So verse 17 says he reasoned. And the definition of the Greek word translated to reason there was to think different thoughts with oneself. Mingle thought with thought. To ponder, revolve in the mind. So it's the same kind of internal conversation you have with yourself as you process information in order to make a decision. Maybe on what your next course of action is going to be in any given situation. If I do this, this might happen. But if I do that, then this might occur. So it's trying to play out the chess game in your mind and anticipate the course of action you're going to need before it happens. He's trying to plan. But this word has a definition as an outward action as well. So not just this internal struggle. So the outward action definition would be to converse, discourse with one, argue, or discuss. So this end of the definition is back and forth conversation, this external definition. This is information that's exchanged out loud between two people, or I guess at least two people. So Paul, formerly educated in the Mosaic Law by a renowned teacher of his day, but he also continued to educate himself as he grew older. An education of the culture that he is surrounded by, observing how these different groups do, what they do. Paul's reasoning came from a basis of knowledge, not just a desire. So where was he going to conduct this reasoning? Now, one place that he chose would have been familiar ground with people of familiar beliefs. Paul went to the synagogue. Now, this was a location that the local Jews and Gentiles would be meeting at. Here, he would have run into folks that have a common religious understanding as he did. They would worship at that location, as well as gather there to discuss maybe topics of interest. You get together with your friends and your people that you know, and you solve all the world's problems. So that was the first place that Paul finds himself or goes to do this reasoning. Now, the second place was the marketplace. Now, this is where it was all happening. It's like the old town square. This is where everyone came together to share news, to talk, to trade. This is where the hustle and bustle was. Here, Paul was going to encounter all that Athens had to offer, person and belief-wise. Many of these people would definitely not share common beliefs held by a Jew or especially a Christian. And according to the rest of verse 17, he was doing this every day, either in the synagogue or the market. He went wherever the Athenians were. This is the type of dedication that was spoken about by Jesus in Luke 9 when he said, "Take up your cross and follow me daily." So step 1, redeem the time. Make the most of it. Step 2, reasoning. Now for step 3, removing the obstacles. So Again, it's always a pattern. There's 3 R's. It's not reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is redeem, reasoning, and then remove. Now, reasoning with individuals about God that were raised and living in a society that is overrun with idolatry was not going to be easy. Their society had embraced it at every level. For some, it would have been all they'd ever known. So convincing someone to turn away from that and be in possible opposition to their friends, their neighbors, their family, I'm guessing it would be like trying to convert all y'all into Tennessee Vols fans, right? It's not going to happen. There's going to be obstacles. So Paul's system included a step to best remove those obstacles and barriers. But this idolatrous society was so open to the idea of all these different gods that it presented Paul with a unique opportunity. I'm going to read from Acts 17, 18 through 21, and this will be from the English Standard Version. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So God's plan in action. It's the right person in the right place every time. But it's up to the person to take action. So spreading the gospel, Paul would be he'd be an action hero. He's a superstar at this. This society was so into learning new things that they pulled Paul aside. They took him to the place where the judicial council met because they wanted to know more about Jesus. They were eager to hear about this new way. Now, we're going to look at some of the potential obstacles that Paul removed. So think about the 2 groups that pulled him aside. The Epicureans, these were pagans. They believed in gods that were indifferent to humans. These gods cared nothing about human affairs. To the Epicureans, humans were an accident of evolution. They believed that matter was eternal, that the soul died with the person, and there was no accounting for the life that was lived in the flesh. This meant for them, it was eat, drink, be merry, live it up while you can. The second group, the Stoics. The Stoics were materialistic pantheists. So their belief is that God was found in everything and in everyone. They believed that fate ruled the world. For them, self-denial and the pursuit of virtue was the highest goal in life. The material provided with this lesson included a quote that said, "Passions and affections were to be suppressed and restrained. Apathy or indifference to either pleasure or pain, or mastery over all desires and lusts, so that none gain control of the man. So these groups are polar opposites. Now, how is Paul going to be able to talk to both of these groups in the same place at the same time? Normally, we would try the divide and conquer method. Let me get this one group alone and talk to them. Let me get this one group alone and talk to them. And then maybe we just don't talk to them all in the same room together because these guys don't believe the same things. But if you go to Acts 17 and you look at verses 22 through 32, it says, "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even for some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. So in verse 29, continuing, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. So what are the obstacles that Paul removed? And this is an interesting look at this, because we typically think about when we're going to remove an obstacle, the obstacle is somewhere in front of us. The obstacle is somewhere in front of the people that Paul's teaching. But in this example, the obstacles are internal to Paul. They are definitely in front of the people that he's teaching, but they are not in front of Paul. They're inside of Paul. So number one, the first obstacle Paul removes is his own prejudice. If he had any prejudices against these individuals that he was going to talk to, he certainly managed to get them out of the way. Paul could have just dismissed them, maybe as too far gone from the simple gospel of Christ. But Paul embraced the opportunity with no hint of prejudice. Number two, Paul's pride. These people described his message as blabber. The Greek word that was used here, it means picking up seed. This referred to people that would show up after a field had been harvested and pick up the loose seeds. To people that would hang around in the market and pick up little scraps of food that get dropped when people are transporting bigger loads. This is how they survived. Well, later on, the word took on a little bit different meaning. It talked about and referred to men that would pick up scraps of information, kind of here and there, and then repeat them like it was their own original idea. Blabber meant that Paul wasn't smart enough to formulate his own thoughts. That all his information was borrowed from other people in other places. So insults can truly be an obstacle. Accusations can be an obstacle for sure. And Paul could have let his human feelings get in the way of his service to God in this instance. Proverbs 19:11 states, "Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense." So instead of allowing his personal feelings to derail his mission, he removed the obstacle of his pride and focused on what it is that he was there to do. The last obstacle that Paul removes while he was in Athens, this internal obstacle, is he put away his pedigree. He knew Mosaic law forwards and backwards. He also knew that the people that he was talking to, they might have been familiar with it, but they weren't versed in it. So notice in his sermon that we just read that there was not one Old Testament reference. Not one scripture quoted. He did actually refer to poets of their day and things that they had said. But instead of presenting his religious pedigree by quoting scripture, Paul put it away and decided to reason with his audience in a more relatable way. So in his visit to Athens, Paul did everything he could to get the message to the residents in a way that they could come to understand the message without sacrificing the truth. So I mentioned two examples in the book of Acts, and we see Paul's system on display. Now the second is found in chapters 19 and 20. Step 1, remember, redeem the time. In his 3 years in Ephesus, he was teaching, he was baptizing, he was performing extraordinary miracles. If you look at chapter 19, verse 11, it mentions that. He held nothing back that was helpful. He reached out to everyone that he could. Not only was his faith fearless, it was relentless. Step 2, in his system, reasoning. So again, he reasoned in the synagogue and the school of Tyrannus. He came across what we would call pupils or learners. He reasoned with them with a series of questions and then explanations. Now, he never questioned their commitment. He didn't question their sincerity, and he didn't question their desire to be saved. He wasn't rude, because everybody knows when you're rude to people, that just brings them in, right? He wasn't condescending. He wasn't accusatory. the intent of his reasoning was to win souls, not win arguments. And that's something that we have to look at. Because when we find ourselves a lot of times in situations where we're wanting to convince someone of something, sometimes we can have a tendency, if it goes off the rails a little bit or if it gets sidetracked, to want to talk to win the argument. But in this case, it loses the soul that you're after. So step 3, again, remove the obstacles. So in Ephesus, there's basically 3 obstacles that Paul removed over his time there. Now this time, they're not internal to Paul. These are external issues. But or they, I guess they could be an obstacle, and that's the thing. You want to make sure that if it's a possibility that you can eliminate it. Number 1, price. So Paul worked a secular job as a tent maker while living in Ephesus. He did this so that he could preach without compensation. He found a way to support his basic needs through being a tent maker so that he could afford to give away the gospel without being a financial burden to those that he was ministering to, requiring them to feed him and to provide him with shelter while he was there teaching them. If he thought that receiving financial support would possibly become an obstacle, he removed it. You know, it's one of those things where the money's there at the beginning, but maybe it runs out at the end. So then maybe they're not sure what to do, and it makes them uncomfortable. Maybe it makes them not want to approach Paul. Paul doesn't want to have that even be a possibility. And he senses that it could be. So he goes ahead and takes it off the table. The next thing, number 2, is place. So after speaking 3 months at the synagogue, there were those in opposition that were making themselves known and speaking evil against what Paul was trying to teach. So he removed this obstacle by moving to the hall of Tyrannus, where he continued to teach for 2 years. Now, the third obstacle that Paul removes is preference. So, Paul informed the elders in Ephesus that he hadn't held back. He had declared to them the whole counsel of God. He wasn't the kind of preacher that only told people what they wanted to hear. He made sure they understood everything that they needed to know. The easy stuff and the hard stuff. It might have been easier just to tell them what didn't cause them issues and just move on. You know, he might have preferred to just kind of halfway inform them, and maybe they would treat him nice, make him a meal. Maybe they'd buy one of his tents. So he removed the obstacle of his personal preference out of his love for their soul. Now, Paul didn't know these individuals necessarily when he first met them. But Paul recognized again that contained within them was the same thing that was contained within him. And that was a soul created by God. A soul that was loved by God. And a soul that saw God's Son sacrificed for the sake of that soul. So Paul's system, this making sure you're making the best of your time, to go through the process and be mindful. So when Paul looks, and I was going to see, let me go back and reference this. When Paul talks about, trying to make the best of this, this time that he's got. Paul treats time with urgency. Paul sees it running out. Paul knows there's going to be an end, that you don't just have forever. You might not be able to take your time. What he was there to do was to spread the word. He was there to scatter the seed. Stays around for a little while, helps water it, but then it's time to move on. There's a lot of people that he's got to talk to. I'm sure Paul felt like he needed to talk to everybody. Paul, being a persecutor of the early church, and being that he's walking on the road and that Christ appears to him personally, that the men around him can't really see what's going on, but that was what was going on. That he probably felt like, I've got to talk to as many people as possible. I've got to keep moving. I've got to keep finding people. Now, we do know that Paul would make his rounds. And he's writing to these churches to encourage them. But redeeming the time, making the best use of our time. That second step of reasoning, of making sure that how we go about spreading the gospel and the techniques that we use, or the understanding, the way we educate ourselves to the audience that we're talking to. When we were at Warner Robins Church of Christ, we did a series, and it was called Getting to Know Your Religious Neighbors. So most of us have neighbors that we live at least close by. Do you know what church they attend? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you do know what church they attend, do you know what your common ground is with these people? You probably know where you're different. We all know where we're different. Like, they probably have a piano in their church. I bet they don't take the Lord's Supper every Sunday. We start piling up all these differences. How are we different? That's not the right reasoning to get to talk to these folks. The reasoning is, how are we the same? How can I start a conversation with this person that I'm wanting to be focused on God? How can I start that conversation and not instantly drive a wedge between me and that person? Instantly make them feel like this person thinks they're that much different than me, but we're the same. You don't want to start it off that way. So you've got to make sure that you use the reasoning to understand who your audience is. That you use your reasoning to understand what it is that they know or where they're at versus maybe where they need to be or where they're going. And then that third piece of removing obstacles. That's the thing. Again, I was kind of taken aback in the material that was provided for this. You know, as I'm reading through this, I'm thinking Paul in Athens, and man, there are plenty of obstacles that are going to happen. And the obstacles that they present are all internal to Paul. You know, I didn't think of Paul that way. I think of Paul as fearless, right? I think of Paul as a person of action, talking, preaching, writing letters, encouraging. I don't think about Paul having this internal struggle with who he is and how he was raised and how he was educated. I don't think of Paul and his human nature to be offended when people make snide comments about you. When they talk down to you or down about you. Maybe not even to your face, but you hear it. That's tough. Sometimes that same information, that same obstacle can come up within us. Again, the example that I'll use is that we know that when someone asks us, so, oh yeah, where do you attend church? I say, well, I attend at the Prattville Church of Christ. And they give you the, most of the time, if you'll just be patient, they'll ask you. So y'all don't have any instruments at your church. Y'all don't have like a band, or y'all don't have a choir. Y'all don't have that. Like, no. So I could get defensive about it. I could want to jump in real quick and tell them why. That's not going to do any good. That's not the method. That's not the obstacle getting removed. That's me making sure that obstacle can't move. That's me shoring it up, bolting it down, building it taller. Because to them, and they see that defensive mechanism pop up in me, it's not going to win anybody to me. It's probably not even going to want them to talk to me. It's not going to make them want to talk to me more. I will tell you, I watched my dad and my uncle do this one time with a couple of gentlemen that came and knocked on our door. And they asked about the Bible. And they asked about, do you know where the Jehovah's Witnesses meet in your town? Well, at that point, my dad and my uncle are in the house. My dad says, do you gentlemen have your Bibles with you? And they said, yes. He said, why don't you come on in? My uncle promptly shut the door behind them. And there they were in the house for almost 2 hours. My uncle between them and the door. They wanted to talk to him. I think it was just more of a curiosity to find out some of the ins and outs. But if my dad and my uncle's intent was to convert these two gentlemen, the method that they used absolutely was not going to work. It probably just made them really nervous. So we have to work hard at making sure that our own personal obstacles don't become an obstacle for the gospel. We have to be able to remove those obstacles. So that is all the material I've got this evening. I appreciate everybody's time. I don't know if they're having everybody stay in here, if we're just waiting. Does anybody know? Oh, go get your snacks? Where are your snacks at, in the back room? Oh, all right. Well, you're welcome to it then. Thank y'all very much.